London, December 2003. The basement studio of Island Records buzzed with the controlled chaos of a major label session. Steam rose from coffee cups abandoned on mixing boards, while cigarette smoke created halos around the dim track lighting. This wasn't Abbey Road or Air Studios. This was where the label tested new sounds, where promising artists cut demos, where careers were made or quietly forgotten. Simon Wells, Island's head of A&R, checked his Rolex for the third time in 10 minutes. The session was running late, the budget was tight, and his patience was wearing thin. He'd been chasing this particular jazz soul sound for months, convinced it could be the next big thing. Not the manufactured pop dominating the charts, but something with weight, something with history. "Where's the bloody vocalist?" Wells muttered to his assistant, Marcus, who shuffled through papers nervously. "Traffic, sir. Should be here any moment." The band was ready, piano, bass, drums, and a small string section squeezed into the cramped space. They'd been warming up for an hour, running through chord progressions, finding the pocket. Professional session players, the kind who showed up on time, played their parts perfectly, and went home without drama. In the corner, almost invisible among the equipment cases, sat a 19-year-old girl with dark hair piled into a messy beehive. Amy Winehouse picked at her black fingernail polish, occasionally humming along with the musicians' warm-up. She'd been hired for £15 to sing backing vocals, nothing more. The receptionist who'd booked her had been clear. "Just harmonies, love. Don't get any ideas about stepping forward." Amy had taken the tube from Camden, wearing her father's old suit jacket over a vintage dress she'd found at Portobello Market. She looked like she'd stepped out of a 1960s jazz club, which wasn't accidental. While her peers were listening to garage and R&B, Amy had been discovering Dinah Washington and Sarah Vaughan, spending hours in her bedroom learning their phrasing, their timing, their fearless, emotional honesty. "Right," Wells announced to the room, clapping his hands together. "Let's get started. We'll do body and soul first, then see how it feels. Marcus, where's our lead singer?" Before Marcus could answer, the studio door opened, and their vocalist stumbled in, clearly the worse for wear from the night before. Her hair was disheveled, her makeup smeared, and she moved with the careful deliberation of someone fighting off a serious hangover. Sorry, she mumbled, making her way to the microphone. Traffic was mental. Wells exchanged a look with the engineer. This wasn't what they'd paid for. The vocalist had been impressive in auditions, a powerful voice with good control. But this version, hungover and unprepared, was a different story entirely. "All right, let's just run through it once," Wells said, his voice tight with controlled frustration. The band started the introduction to Body and Soul, that timeless jazz standard that had been a test for vocalists since the 1930s. The piano laid down the opening chords, rich and melancholy, while the bass walked through the changes with practiced ease. The vocalist opened her mouth and began to sing. The melody was there, technically correct, but it felt hollow. She hit the notes but missed the soul, delivered the words without understanding their weight. It was karaoke-level performance art, competent but lifeless. Amy winced from her corner. She'd grown up with this song, had listened to Billie Holiday's version until the vinyl wore thin. This wasn't how it was supposed to sound. This wasn't how it was supposed to feel. "Let's try it again," Wells said after the first run-through, his diplomatic tone barely masking his disappointment. "Maybe with a bit more feeling this time?" The second attempt was worse. The vocalist, now aware she was failing, became self-conscious. Her timing wavered, her pitch suffered, and what little emotion she'd managed the first time disappeared entirely. The band kept playing, professional to the end, but Amy could see the resignation in their faces. Wells called for a break. "This isn't working," he said quietly to Marcus, thinking no one else could hear. "She sounded completely different in the audition. Maybe we need to consider other options." "The session's booked until 6, Marcus replied. "We could try to get someone else down here, but at short notice." Amy had been listening to this conversation while pretending to study the chord charts someone had left on her chair. She knew every note of Body and Soul, could sing it in her sleep. She'd performed it at the jazz clubs in Camden had made hardened musicians stop their conversations and listen. But she also knew her place. Backup vocalist. 15 pounds for the day. Don't get any ideas about stepping forward. The break stretched longer than planned. The vocalist had disappeared to the bathroom and hadn't returned. Wells paced the small space, checking his phone, calculating how much studio time they were wasting. The musicians chatted quietly among themselves, professional patience wearing thin. "Where is she?" Wells finally exploded. "We're burning money here." Marcus tried the bathroom door. Locked, knocked gently. No response. "I think she might have left," one of the session players said. "Saw her heading toward the stairs about 10 minutes ago." Wells's face went through several shades of red before settling on a dangerous purple. This was his session, his budget, his reputation on the line. He'd promised the label executives something special, had talked up this jazz soul fusion concept for weeks. Now his vocalist had literally walked out, leaving him with a room full of expensive musicians and nothing to show for it. "Right," he said, his voice dangerously calm. "Anyone know any singers? Anyone at all?" The room fell silent. Session players didn't usually double as vocalists, at least not at this level. They were hired for their instrumental skills, their ability to serve the music without drawing attention to themselves. "What about her?" one of the musicians said, nodding toward Amy's corner. Wells looked over as if seeing her for the first time. "She's just backing vocals." "Yeah, but she's been humming along perfectly all morning. Every change, every phrase. She knows the song." Amy felt 20 pairs of eyes turn toward her. Her stomach dropped to somewhere around her ankles. This wasn't what she'd signed up for. She was supposed to stay invisible, earn her 15 pounds, and go home with a story about working at Island Records. "Can you sing lead?" Wells asked her directly. Amy's throat went dry. "In Camden jazz clubs, sure. In her bedroom with the door closed, absolutely. But in a professional studio, with a famous A&R executive staring at her like she might be his salvation or his final disappointment?" I know the song," she managed. "That's not what I asked. Can you sing it properly?" Something in his tone stung. The assumption that she couldn't, that she was just some kid they'd hired to fill space in the background. Amy had been underestimated her entire life. Too young, too inexperienced, too working class, too everything that didn't fit the industry's idea of a professional vocalist. She stood up from her corner, walked to the microphone, and adjusted the height without saying a word. The room watched in silence as she tested the mic, tapped it twice, then looked at the piano player. "Same key?" she asked. He nodded and began the introduction again. Amy closed her eyes and let the first few bars wash over her. Body and Soul wasn't just a song to her. It was a conversation between the vocalist and the melody, an intimate confession set to music. She'd learned it from Billie Holiday, but she'd made it her own in the small hours of Camden mornings, singing it to empty rooms and imaginary audiences. When she opened her mouth and began to sing, the room went completely still. Her voice was nothing like the previous vocalists. Where the other singer had been technically correct but emotionally vacant, Amy was raw honesty wrapped in perfect pitch. She didn't just sing the melody, she inhabited it, made it a living thing that breathed and ached and hoped. "My heart is sad and lonely. For you I sigh, for you dear only." The words came out with the weight of experience that seemed impossible for someone barely out of her teens. But Amy had always been old for her age, had grown up listening to singers who understood heartbreak as a fundamental human condition. She sang like someone who'd lived through the lyrics, who'd earned the right to voice their pain. The band, professionals who'd backed hundreds of vocalists, found themselves playing differently. The pianist added subtle flourishes he'd been holding back all day. The bassist locked into a groove that made the whole room pulse. Even the drummer, usually content to keep simple time, began to paint delicate colors around Amy's phrasing. But it was Amy's voice that transformed the space. She took the standard jazz interpretation and twisted it just enough to make it contemporary, adding a slight roughness to her tone that suggested both fragility and strength. Her timing was impeccable but not mechanical. She played with the rhythm like a jazz master, pushing and pulling against the beat in ways that created tension and release. Simon Wells found himself holding his breath. This wasn't what he'd expected from his backup vocalist. This was something else entirely. This was the sound he'd been chasing for months without knowing exactly what it was. Amy sang the entire song without opening her eyes, lost in the music in a way that made everyone else in the room feel like voyeurs. She hit every note, nailed every phrase, but more importantly, she made the song her own. By the time she reached the final, "I'm All For You, Body and Soul," the studio was completely silent except for the last lingering notes from the piano. She opened her eyes and stepped back from the microphone, suddenly aware that everyone was staring at her. The silence stretched for what felt like hours but was probably only seconds. Finally, the piano player began to clap. Slowly at first, then joined by the bassist, then the drummer, then the entire room. It wasn't the polite applause of a successful recording session. It was the genuine appreciation of musicians who just witnessed something special. Wells didn't clap. He couldn't. He was too busy processing what he'd just heard, trying to figure out how he'd nearly missed it. This girl, this 19-year-old he'd hired for backing vocals, had just delivered the exact sound he'd been searching for. Not just technically proficient, but emotionally devastating in the way the great jazz singers had always been. "What did you say your name was?" he asked quietly. "Amy. Amy Winehouse." "Amy Winehouse," Wells repeated, as if testing how it sounded. "Right. Marcus, clear my schedule for the rest of the afternoon. We're going to record everything this girl knows." Amy looked confused. "I thought I was just doing backing vocals." "Not anymore," Wells said. That was exactly what we've been looking for. How many songs can you do like that?" "Like what?" "Like you just lived through them." Amy shrugged. "All of them, I suppose, if they're good songs." The session that followed lasted 4 hours. Amy sang everything from jazz standards to contemporary covers, each performance as captivating as the last. She worked with the band like she'd been playing with them for years, suggesting arrangements, changing keys, making each song sound like it had been written specifically for her voice. Wells recorded everything, knowing he was documenting something remarkable. This wasn't just a good vocalist having a lucky day. This was an artist discovering her power, figuring out what her voice could do when given the space to breathe. By the end of the session, Amy was exhausted but exhilarated. She'd never had the opportunity to work with musicians at this level, had never been in a studio where she could experiment without worrying about budget or time constraints. "We'll be in touch," Wells told her as the session wrapped up, but his tone suggested it would be sooner rather than later. Amy gathered her things and headed for the door, still not entirely sure what had just happened. She'd come in for 15 pounds worth of backing vocals and somehow ended up as the featured performer. "Amy," Wells called after her, "that performance of Body and Soul, where did that come from?" She paused in the doorway. "My bedroom mostly, and some jazz clubs in Camden." "No, I mean, you sang it like someone who'd been doing this for decades. You're 19. "Good songs are good song," Amy said simply. "They tell you how to sing them if you listen properly." After she left, Wells sat in the studio for another hour, listening to the recordings. He'd been in the music industry for 15 years, had worked with established artists and promising newcomers, had developed a reputation for spotting talent, but he'd never heard anything quite like what Amy Winehouse had delivered that afternoon. The planned jazz-soul fusion project was shelved. Instead, Wells began planning something entirely different, something built around the raw honesty and vintage sophistication Amy had brought to those classic songs. 6 months later, Amy's debut album, Frank, was released to critical acclaim. Body and Soul wasn't on it, but the approach she'd discovered that afternoon in the Island Records basement studio informed every track. The combination of jazz sophistication and emotional rawness that had stopped a room full of professionals in their tracks became her signature sound. In interviews promoting the album, journalists often asked Amy about her influences, her background, how someone so young had developed such a mature artistic voice. She usually gave credit to the jazz singers she'd grown up listening to, the Camden scene that had nurtured her, the musicians who'd believed in her talent when others saw only potential problems. But Wells knew the truth. He'd been there the day Amy Winehouse announced herself to the music world, the moment she stepped from the background to center stage and proved that real talent couldn't be contained or categorized. Years later, After Amy's tragic death in 2011, Wells was interviewed for a documentary about her life and career. The interviewer asked about their first meeting, about how he discovered her. "I didn't discover Amy," Wells said quietly. "She was there the whole time. I just had the good fortune to be in the room when she decided to let everyone else see what she could do." What was that moment like? Wells was quiet for a long moment, remembering that December afternoon in the basement studio. "Like watching someone catch fire," he said finally. "You knew immediately that nothing would ever be the same again. For her, for everyone who heard her sing, that voice, that presence. It was like she'd been waiting her whole life for someone to hand her a microphone and get out of the way." Do you think she knew how good she was? In that moment, I think she was too busy being good to think about it. But afterward, walking to the tube station, yeah, I think she knew. How could she not? The whole room had gone silent. Professional musicians, people who'd heard everything, and they were just stunned. The interviewer pressed for more details, but Wells had said everything that mattered. Amy Winehouse had walked into that studio as a backup vocalist and left as an artist. The transformation had taken exactly 4 minutes and 37 seconds, the length of one perfect performance of body and soul. That was the day a legend was born, not through marketing or industry connections or manufactured hype, but through the simple act of a 19-year-old girl stepping up to a microphone and singing like her life depended on it. Because in many ways it did.